For item number 1, determine whether the test is two-tailed or one-tailed. If it is one-tailed, is it left-tailed or right-tailed? Explain and justify your answer. Before we begin to look at the items, let's determine the differences between a two-tailed and a one-tailed test. A two-tailed test uses both the positive traits and the negative trait of distribution, meaning it wouldn't look at just either the greater or the right side of the distribution or the lesser or the left side of the distribution. A one-tailed test is used if your main goal is to determine the difference in either side of the distribution, whether this may be lesser or greater. A right-tailed test indicates that the probability is on the right side of the distribution, implying a difference which is greater, while a left-tailed test indicates that the probability is found on the left side of the distribution, implying a difference which is lesser. Now let's look at the items. Letter A. A nutritionist claims that her developed bread is fortified with vitamin B. This is a one-tailed test that is right-tailed because it uses the word fortified, meaning it wants to see if the bread has an increased and improved amount of vitamin B. Item B. A musician believes that listening to classical music affects mood. This is a two-tailed test since it isn't trying to compare it on only one of either side of the distribution. Item C. A storekeeper thinks that time of day influences the sale of ice cream. This is also a two-tailed test since it isn't trying to compare it on only one of either side of the distribution. Item D. A mother wants to prove that reading books to her children improves their thinking process. This is a one-tailed test that is right-tailed since a mother wants to see if the situation improves their thinking process, making it be on the right side of the distribution. Item E. A certain combination of fruits provides the daily requirements of vitamin C. Lastly, this is also a two-tailed test since it isn't trying to compare it on only one of either side of the distribution.
Explain in your own words. Explain why the null hypothesis is called null. Null means to commonly accept the fact. It is also called null because as the null hypothesis proves that even there are two different ways of proving the statement, it will show that there is no difference. As it shows no difference, null is the hypothesis that is more likely to be more rejected. Like for the example of a null hypothesis that age has no effect on how cell phones are used for internet access, as we can see that there is no relationship between the variables. Thus, a null is something that should be tested to prove the data that has been gathered, whether if it is true or false. Explain the usefulness of the normal curve in hypothesis testing. Since the hypothesis testing assumes that the distribution of the test statistic, the standard normal curve or a bell-shaped curve has become the reference for many problem-solving and probability distribution, and including the problems about hypothesis testing, and that proves the usefulness of the normal curve in hypothesis testing. In number 3, state the null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis in words and in symbols for each of the following problems. So letter A. A librarian of school claims that all their grade 8 students read in advance of 10 storybooks a month, the standard deviation of 2 books. A random sample of grade 8 students read in advance of 12 books a month and a standard deviation of 1 book. The confidence statement is 95%. In words, the hypothesis is HO. The simple comes from those students who read books in a month whose mean is 10, or H sub 1. The sample does not come from those students who read books in a month whose mean is 10. In symbols, letter B. According to the factory employers, the mean working time of workers in the factory is 6 hours with a standard deviation of 0.5 hours. A researcher interviewed 50% of the employees and found out that their mean working time is 8 hours with a standard deviation of 1 hour. The level is 0.05. In words, the hypothesis is the sample comes from the average of factory employers with a working time whose mean is 6, or the sample does not come from the average of factory employers with a working time whose mean is 6. In symbols, sample of 200 students got a mean score of 62 with a standard deviation of 5 in the knowledge test in mathematics. Insert the standardization of the test with, in words, the hypothesis is, the sample comes from the 200 students in taking this mathematics test whose mean is 50 equal or greater than 10, or the sample does not come from 200 students in taking in this mathematics test whose mean is 50 less than 10 in symbols.
For item number 4, in your own words, answer and explain the following questions. So here we have the sub-questions in which A, between the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis, what is a good reason for starting a hypothesis test with the null hypothesis? Letter B, suppose it is Christmas season and Janine thinks that it is the month of January. What error is she committing? Now for letter C, what type of error is committed when you reject a null hypothesis when it is in fact true? So for sub-question A, when we conduct a hypothesis test, one of the goals is to see whether or not to reject the null hypothesis. If we do reject the null hypothesis, it goes to show that we have enough evidence to support the alternative hypothesis. And if we fail to reject the null hypothesis, therefore we can say that we do not have enough evidence to support the alternative hypothesis. This means that the null hypothesis becomes a basis for the entire hypothesis testing process. Now for the sub-question B, so the error committed in the situation is a type 2 error. The null hypothesis in the statement is that this currently the month of January when it is in fact false as it is still currently the Christmas season. However, Janine still accepts the null hypothesis, therefore showing that the situation shows a type 2 error as Janine still accepts the false null hypothesis. Lastly, here we have sub-question C. The error committed when you reject a null hypothesis when it is in fact true is called a type 1 error. An example situation that commits a type 1 error is when you can't swim and you go check how deep the water is. The null hypothesis is that the water is too deep for you and it is in fact true. You reject the true null hypothesis and decide to jump in the water anyway and nearly drown. So that is all for item number 4.
Lastly, for item number 5, we have the instructions determine whether the test is directional or non-directional. For item A, we have a researcher claims that method of teaching affects learning. This statement is a non-directional since it says that the method of teaching affects learning, but it didn't state if it is a positive or a negative effect. Let's move on to letter B. A food additive enhances food flavor. In my understanding, this statement is a directional due to the keyword enhances, and so as item C, which states that a study habit improves the memory. It is also directional because of the keyword improves. It predicts the direction wherein it is stated as a positive effect from the keywords stated in the given. For item D, health is related to lifestyle. The statement is non-directional because it is not a fixed statement and it does not predict the kind of effect, but it states the relationship of health to lifestyle. Lastly, in item E, states that people's culture affects tourism. This is a non-directional since the statement says people's culture affects tourism, but it didn't state in what way it affects tourism.